Hello, and we are live. How's everybody doing? I hope you're doing well.
Live again, it's Friday.
Yes, looking forward to the weekend, but also glad to be here with you to do our weekly live video.
So, it's an interesting week. Obviously, the last few weeks have been quite the weather scene, but we haven't had much snow, and I think
we thought we were going to. And then it's kind of these nor'easters are just like all over the place. We don't really know until the day of kind of what to expect. So that kind of got us thinking about our topic this week, and we figured we would cover 7 legendary Staten Island storms of the last 50 years or so in our recent memory.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic, and I know that from Staten Islanders, they like nostalgia, so nostalgia is definitely fun to talk about. But I mean, we're going to talk about some other issues. Obviously, in Cranes, New York, a couple of days ago, they talked about development. They talked about the impacts of how the lack of a vision,
the lack of kind of a cohesive vision. Well, while we have been having a lot of new projects in Staten Island, we have all the North Shore development, the Wheel, the Empire Outlets. We have Irby on the North Shore, and then we have in Mid-Island for Highland Plaza, which is going to be the new name of the plaza is escaping me, but it's going to be this revamped plaza with a dinner theater. Charleston Commons, big one on the South Shore. Mm-hmm. So a lot of things are happening. A lot of people are moving to Staten Island. Real estate's really, really hot. But this article was interesting because it was from a Staten Island resident, basically saying that we don't really have a vision for where it's all going.
Yeah, there's the lack of cohesion within the development.
There's not enough really communication and themes about like the way that these things flow.
Yeah, when we talk about development overall on Staten Island, we talk about contextual development, and I think in the article in Cranes, New York, which is if you head on over to Cranes, New York, it basically it was a local architect that actually wrote the op-ed piece.
Yes.
So it's an interesting take on creating a more comprehensive vision for the type of development we kind of gotten used to over the years, which is not necessarily
not necessarily
consistent.
Working for the influx of new people coming in either.
Right. And it was funny because when you read the comments, you happened to read the comment section, and one of the comments was, of course, being from Staten Island and having all the Staten Islanders, read up and give comments is like the door closes once you get to Staten Island, and I think, and that's a lot of the process, unfortunately, with the types of development we're kind of used to on Staten Island, which is that kind of bedroom community to New York City, and that changes the context at which we occupy and use land, and
the Verrazano Bridge opened about 50 years ago.
But we had talked about this in some of our other segments about the state of development, where like concentrations in St. George and such, that it is a concentrated population base, but yet traffic is not a concern there because the transportation infrastructure is better suited, being that it's walkable to ferry transportation. Mm-hmm. Most of the local businesses are supportive at the street level to the community itself, so you get a lot of what I call walking community type of feel.
A lot of people there don't actually have cars or even need them.
Right, which is an interesting take, because I think when we talk about that type of development, I think people kind of confuse that density somehow has something to do with traffic. And we said this before, the nature of housing in general, and I've read some pretty good research on this about how we really develop our towns, is basically a 1950s type of concept, where the automobile was a very, very key part of developing infrastructure for cities. People moved far away. The suburbs in the 50s, if you know, basically became part of the American landscape.
Right.
And that's what you see, a lot of what Staten Island's current zoning is based around.
Now exactly. You hit on the zoning as a key
point.
And
I think that's when people look at it and they say, well, is it matching the needs? And I want to talk about that for a minute, because when you talk about needs, You talk about a population of 500,000 people, which makes Staten Island as a city quite extensive. We have a pretty high concentration of people here, and the fact that exists,
and it's only growing more and more.
Yeah, and I think what really happens is, like I said, and she makes some very good points and some very, very valid arguments. Is that there's not a single vision about what Staten Island is, even though it is in the scope of things I would consider a city onto its own.
Yeah.
And so you look for those kind of downtown areas. You look for that kind of
right, which we don't have in the same sense that
right.
the rest of New York City does. Like, we don't really have a downtown Staten Island.
Yeah, I mean,
there was
St.
a
George
plan for that for Stapleton and St. George,
right.
and it just kind of never really panned out the way that the economic development.
And I think one of the things when the zoning task force was commissioned, and which fortunately I happened to be a part of, one of the things was looking at the town centers as being much more amenable to young professionals that would use more of the transportation network and kind of make an efficiency within the transportation system that people could kind of move back and forth without having to necessarily use a car. So I mean, these were some of the things that were looked at, but like I said, it draws a lot of resistance. A lot of old-time Staten Islanders are not big fans of any type of
development.
Development is a real issue for them overall. So I mean, it's something to kind of.
They're clinging to their single-family homes.
Yeah, I mean,
in a way they don't actually want any other type of zoning sometimes. Right. But that kind of holds back the development.
And for the politicians' sake, it makes a very difficult choice to make because of that factor.
Yeah.
Is that this is their constituent base? They don't want it. It's hard to get reelected to office if you're not toting that line.
Right.
So I mean, it's a kind of it's an odd situation, and sometimes in situations like that, and sometimes maybe locally is not the best place to decide on the better structure of how things are because of the types of political pressures that are applied in order to keep things the same.
So even people that do want to improve these things just meet a lot of resistance.
They meet a lot of resistance, and mainly because of the fact that you don't want to offend constituency as part of a master plan. That's why you don't see one. So if you want to look at the dynamic of what our complaint is looks at a very singular type of system of basically how to maneuver politics into that question. So it's definitely something to really add as part of that equation is that there's a lot of political pressure on the part of politicians to actually create meaningful change within the zoning laws. But so you wind up with these like weird projects based on some BSA changes, water standards appeals, and things like that. But it's all technical stuff, but the need for a master plan is definitely something that the future of Staten Island definitely should look at, because I do think that not all the development is actually in the right places.
And it doesn't always connect well, one development with another.
Yeah, I mean, it's the cohesion between the transportation networks. But it's quite an extensive topic, and we probably will touch on that 1,000 times in the next 50 times we do this.
We'll see. We talked about the new bus plan last week. We'll see if the express bus plan helps transportation at all.
Yeah, I mean, but moving off of that, but it's an interesting topic on Trains New York. You want to check that out.
Yeah, read the article. It's worth a read. Not too long.
Yeah, and you could throw your opinion into the mix.
Yeah.
Mortgage rates are holding steady again, right? You looked at that?
They're actually down the first time this year, about 0.1%.
Isn't that strange?
Yes, not what I expected.
If you're looking for that, yeah, if you're looking for the kind of, like help to the inventory situation, yeah, of course this just drives people. Even it's driving the market higher, and we've talked about affordability.
Well, especially if they fall anymore, they're down to 4.44%.
So you hear that now? It's time to get your house.
It was up to 4.64 like 2 weeks ago.
And I think in light of that, people feel that maybe that maybe somehow that may pick things up again in the market. So we'll be watching this moving forward. I think in the next couple of segments, we'll look at this and see if there's actually some correlation between how this month deals with pendings based on lower interest rates. But
Right.
for the home sellers, I mean, this is just, I mean, they're reaping a whirlwind of growth in their home values, which makes it definitely an intriguing time to sell. So, I mean, it's something that Staten Islanders have really, they've gone past the national trend of home growth. So it's unparalleled. So you look at Staten Island, and there's been a lot of articles in regards to Staten Island being the last frontier on the
Final frontier in New York City.
yeah in New York City as far as available types of any type of available affordability.
And that time looks like it's kind of coming to a close, maybe.
Yeah. So when those 10 houses start going for $700,000,
Oof.
like they do in Brooklyn once upon a time.
They're already starting to. We've sold some townhouses
Yeah, I mean,
over
it's
600.
Yeah, it's definitely a time that
It's a wide
I haven't
ride.
experienced, so it's really interesting. But as we get into, and it's always good because one of the things is like we always talk about nostalgic topics and things that we remember. I mean,
Maybe
I don't
not all
want to
good
profess my
memories,
age
yeah.
on live, but I've been here for a few decades.
Yeah.
And one
years.
of the things about that is that March is always a crazy month, and
It has been. for
yes,
us.
and it's really it's a time that looking back, the crazy types of weather we've had especially over the last 15 years, last 20 years, it's really been dramatic. So we're going to kind of look at these things and see basically what our thoughts are on some of the stuff, some of the storms that
Major weather events of your lifetime, let's just say of your lifetime, in recent memory.
You're from Florida, so
I haven't lived here for as long as you have.
Right.
So, I'm going to be
But you
relying...
experienced some of these.
One of them on the list, I remember. Only one. So I'm going to be mostly
So
relying
you weren't
on...
here in Sandy?
Right after Sandy.
Right
It was
after-
like
that's
3
right.
months after Sandy that I moved here, so I kind of just dodged that bullet. Unintentionally, it wasn't like planned that way. But I'm going to be mostly relying on kind of your own experiences because some of these storms on the list were not named storms, so they didn't necessarily make history in the
Yes.
same way that a hurricane would, and yet caused severe amounts of damage. And
Well, they're notable
Big
for
stories.
various reasons, whether it was impactful in the sense that just the size, the amount, not necessarily damage related, but there are some interesting takes. And that 2010 to 2012 period was quite an interesting time for like historical records in terms of Staten Island and the situation dealing with the impacts of weather on it on this little place.
you can tell me more about what it was like to see
But we're going
that
to give
with
you,
your
we're
own
going to start
eyes.
with number 7.
Yes.
You can get give them number 7.
And number 7, not too distant past, February 2006, unnamed storm. We're starting off on the right foot. Record holder for the most ever snow in New York City, which was almost 27 inches, and it snowed for 3 days straight.
The interesting thing, and like, it's not the top of the list, but it's one of the bigger storms in Staten Island, and this is actually during the Bloomberg era. And the interesting thing was that as bad as and high as the amounts of snow was, it was not terribly oppressive in terms of transportation. I remember actually traveling in this storm.
Really?
Yeah, I had to work at Office of Emergency Management, and I had to drive to down by the Brooklyn Bridge, and
They didn't close the bridge?
No, and basically, if you want to believe this, it was blacktop all the way through. So it was kind of
Because of all the cars traveling.
well, no, there was no cars traveling at that time. They were just much more efficient at snow removal.
Okay.
I'll credit my former boss for handling
For-
that. Yeah, for like having
Staying
an
on top
efficient
of
city.
sanitation.
But it was actually everything was So for Staten Island, it's not really so much notable as some of the other ones, which is number 6.
It made our list kind of for the amount of snowfall, not so much for the damage that it caused.
Yes.
It came out mostly unscathed after the snow melted. So number 6 is the only one that I personally experienced, which was Winter Storm Jonas, January 2016.
Yeah, Jonas was
2 years ago.
Yeah, and Jonas, these names, I love how Jonas and these.
This one got a name this time.
Yeah, this one got a name because there's basically what had happened was the Weather Channel needed to create more buzzworthy names for storms. So this is what they did. This is actually, if you want to know, winter storm names were generated through the Weather Channels per se. They made these names to
pretty much to improve their ratings.
Well, it's an interesting thing because the nostalgia part is that relating to things by name seem to work. But that was 2000. I mean, it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, and that was actually on this list the most recorded snow in Staten Island.
32 inches.
Department of Sanitation measured 32 inches on Staten Island.
It was and the experiences with that was if you're a Staten Islander, you remember that particular
almost
event.
3 feet.
And if you actually go to our page, we actually have some photos of some of the storms to talk about. Jonas was the one that's pictured at the main screen. So it was.
Yeah, that was our trivia this week.
Yeah, and some people debate, and there's some debate over this controversy between that storm and the '96 storm. And if you're talking from a Staten Island standpoint, I do remember the '96 storm being worse than that. Not sure why, but how snow is measured is kind of strange when there's a lot of winds. So those two are kind of up there, but
it says there was a ban
we put it at
on
6. We actually put that ahead. We actually put that below the '96, which we do have ranked as 4 here, but that's a little preview.
Jumping ahead.
Yeah, but
it says that there was a ban on vehicles, buses, and the Staten Island Railway shut down.
So basically,
the city was taking it pretty seriously.
Yeah, at the time. But if you remember, and you said you don't really remember too much about that storm, even though you were here, right?
I was working. I was freelancing at home from the time, so I don't think I traveled for like a couple days. I didn't have to move my car. I was lucky. I think anybody who drove on the road probably remembers it more than I do.
Yeah, it was. But like I said, I think as far as the impacts, it definitely was more notable for the snowfall and things like that than it was for much of the other things that were associated. The other 55-mile-per-hour winds. We don't remember that being extremely powerful in terms of that.
For some of the storms on this list.
Yeah, for some of the storms, but it's definitely up there. But if you look, the oddity enough in this is that even through the historical records, a lot of the most damaging and the most prolific storms have actually happened more recently than at any other time in the past. So that's an interesting. But
it does say that 2 people were killed, and I read in Staten Island alone, and apparently from shoveling snow.
Yeah, that's always a thing with snowstorms. It's you get quite a bit of that around the nation. If you have heart problems and you go out and shovel snow, it's like running a 10-mile marathon. So a lot of people aren't in the physical condition to do so. And there's been pushes to by certain organizations to help assist in those things ever since some of these storms kind of evolving. So but it was, like I said, it wasn't the most impactful because you said you basically had a hard time remembering it. So, but it's on there. I remember a lot of snow.
I'm lucky I didn't have to shovel with.
So on to
number 5.
Yeah, which is Hurricane Irene.
Yes.
Hurricane Irene. Everybody remembers that. Now that's an interesting one because some people, and believe it or not, this was kind of an oddity in the sense that the tropical nature of the storm. I guess it didn't hold together quite as well, and the difference between that and Sandy is kind of an interesting one. But there were places on Staten Island that were extremely impacted by it. So it's not like
some real bad flooding.
Yeah, and one of the things was in the Bull's Head area. There were water rescues taking place regularly in the creek lands behind, and Staten Island's kind of a dynamic set of saltwater creeks and things like that. And one of the interesting things was the backlog of water actually kind of made its way around the back of Staten Island, flooding out places that would seem inland, but would not necessarily be, you'd say, wow, why did it happen there? But a lot of it has to do with the channeling for the Kilvan Cull, and some of the water backing up through there caused a significant amount of damage to very specific neighborhoods. But it was notable in the sense that, there were rowboats on Highland Boulevard.
I saw some photos. There were parts of the boulevard that were closed off with police tape.
Yeah, so and a lot of people would, by a lot of terms, would say, not realizing that in 2011, would say that was a pretty significant event. But it's kind of buried behind a lot of so much of the more specifically Sandy behind that curve a bit. Yeah, so it was a year later, but that 2010 path to 2012 was definitely probably the worst 3 weather years in Staten Island history.
We've been getting, I guess, not quite as bad over the last 5 years.
Yeah, it's definitely been. A lot of people debate whether global warming is a real thing or not, and it's hard to make a case against it to the degree that the impacts that you see here, specifically over the last most of the severe weather events in the concentrations
have been happening post 2000.
Yeah, post 1990. Really, when you talk about the 92 Nor'easter, you're talking about some significant, most of the significant weather that we've been accustomed to, while maybe we would consider a 50-year storm, are happening at a much rapid pace. And that's, like I said, we're not scientists here, but, there's always cause and effect to everything.
Right.
And definitely, probably some global warming has a play in that.
Yeah, I'm not going to debate that. Certainly, I respect the expertise of our climate scientists.
Yeah, I think for the most part they don't really get it, all of it. I think that, and the interesting thing is that one of the things when I've looked at these, and you know me, kind of, I like to, I have that weather buff in me. Which is always fun.
And you're actually a lot more accurate than some of the meteorologists in the area.
Yeah, but it's funny because you kind of read it, but off the coast here, the sea surface temperature is, on average, have been extremely high, and what happens is that you have this transfer
that creates a perfect storm.
Yeah, you have this transfer of energy because you have sea surface temperatures sometimes ranging 5-6 degrees above normal. On a consistent yearly basis over and over and over.
Right.
And so right off of our coast here, especially along the Jersey Shore and things like that, weather contrasts, when you have a warmer ocean and colder air masses coming out of Canada, you get these types of explosive developments, which is these contrasts between temperatures. If that water temperature is up,
even if it's 3 degrees.
3 degrees is pretty substantial in that fact. So it's real in terms of you have bombogenesis and bomb cyclone. We kind of make fun of that. But the interesting thing about those events is what they call, and that's basically what it is how quickly the pressure drops on the storm in the time it does. 10 millibar drop in a 24-hour period. So you talk about these huge sudden things, because the energies that, when you talk about the bigger the contrast between the cold and the warm, the quicker and rapidly these things develop and the stronger. So it's kind of interesting. I believe that there is some correlation between the two. Exactly how they play out, I do not spend a lifetime of research on, but it probably plays a part.
I'm sure it does.
So
moving on to the next spot, which is Blizzard of 96.
Yeah, 96. 96 was paralyzing. So
public schools
anybody
closed for 2 days, which is very unusual.
Yeah, and that was 96. You know, it was hard to close a school. I think it was one of the times when I think before the 96 blizzard, it was like almost like 12 years, even in the worst weather conditions, they just never closed public schools. And there was always debate.
Even though there were only 10 kids that showed up in every class.
Yeah, and believe it or not, I had to do with federal funding because the school days being open had there was this thing about you had to be open a certain amount of days to get federal funding for education.
Oh, okay.
So that's so there was almost like a stall. So I believe it may have been 92 when the first, somewhere in there where they closed schools, but it was like the first time in like 10 or 12 years. So it was a strange time in school closing history. So for 2 days, and that was under a pretty tough administration that liked to keep the schools open, which was the Giuliani administration. It was hard to get a school closed. But he was this was a homebound situation, I think, and that's probably the most notable part.
Staten Island probably the hardest out of any part of the city.
Yes, and the interesting thing is that,
and that's probably why it doesn't make history as much as some of these other
this is an interesting time because it was the first time the National Guard was deployed here. And a lot of people don't remember that the National Guard was deployed in helping people get to hospitals. And literally, you could have an SUV. I never forgot this piece of it. I happened to live on a dead-end street at the time that an SUV tried to make it down the street and basically went about 4 feet, and that was the end. It was stuck in the middle. And if you didn't have a plow, if it wasn't plowed, you were basically homebound. It was an interesting, I remember being quite a little nervous at the fact that you were so limited to what you could do because of the heights were just immense. And then after the storm, you could literally drive the streets and you wouldn't even see the roofs or just see the roofs of houses because the mounds of snow associated with its removal. And sometimes you couldn't get out for 3 days.
Yeah.
I was basically stuck. You were basically stuck for 3 days. And
hence the term snowed in.
And the interesting thing is
painfully
that
accurate.
When they talk about the bread and milk situation,
gotta get the bread and milk.
That situation actually called for it because you could literally
start to run out of food.
Well, 3 days, 3 days of really not being able to move outside. I mean, you'd have a difficult time actually opening the door of a house. I mean, so that was definitely a memorable one.
That says Department of Sanitation measured 29.25 inches of snow on Staten Island that year.
Yeah.
And says 154 people killed in the whole Northeast region from that storm.
Yeah. And
so strong winds as well, I imagine.
The other thing associated with that specific storm was, we in the Northeast, we tend to have warmer temperatures during snowfall events. So usually they hover in and around the 28 to 32 degree range for optimal snow here. The interesting thing is that particular storm was extremely cold. Temperatures ranged between 17 and 19 degrees while that was continuing. So it was really the type of power and not only the frigidness that really probably led to a lot more of the fatalities associated with that.
Did a lot of people lose power on the island?
I couldn't recall, but I would tell you that it was notable in the sense that just the fact that the homeboundness of where you were stuck probably played a role in a lot of people not making it through. You talk about homebound elderly would expect care, not getting it for 3 days. Some people without heat, not being able to reach anybody.
Or maybe the exhaust in some people's houses could have been.
Yeah, and that was a big factor as well. So, when we talk about number 4, we talk about really a lot of impacts that specifically to the homebound and people who didn't have access to things. I think, and also from a preparedness factor, the fact that New York City had not experienced anything similar to that left a lot of emergency management people on alert to kind of figure out how to get to people, which was the call to the National Guard. Humvees were stationed here as a way of because ambulances were actually unable to attend 911 calls. So I mean, you couldn't get an ambulance during the storm. If something serious happened medically, you were on your own, and that was a scary prospect. Yeah, I mean, not to say that anybody, it's a weird situation. Is that there is no help for a 911 call. There's no way of passing. So there's basically no police cars operating, no public transportation operating, no food or delivery. So even if you went to the store, nobody may be there. So it was kind of a weird. It's not something I think Staten Islanders were used to, but I do think that some of the events leading to that have led for better preparations for such events. But I don't think at the time New York was as prepared for something of that magnitude. I think you have to go back in the records, back to I believe into the 1800s to see a storm similar to that size.
Bad. Well, it's funny. This is another unnamed storm I noticed. So unnamed storms don't tend to get the sensationalism that hurricane would, for example.
Yeah, maybe not in your parts.
Probably no. Well,
but
no.
It's definitely
we
out there.
Just had hurricanes, and for Hurricane Irene or for Hurricane Sandy, obviously there were evacuation warnings. But for a storm like this, I'm sure there wasn't any. For
the blizzard of '96, yeah. I mean, there wasn't really much associated with the fact of coastal flooding being as big a concern there. I think it was an nor'easter-like storm. And the interesting thing, if you're from Staten Island, basically, what you really know about coastal flood situations is that in the worst coastal flooding situations, you usually, in Staten Island particularly, just the nature of how we're situated, the storms do not usually they're not snowmakers because of the fact that the low pressure centers are closer to the coastline, driving more wind against the shore. So usually when you talk about coastal flood situations, you very rarely talk about snow necessarily being the bigger factor there. So coastal flooding was not, like I said, the storms, if you know meteorology, the 40-70 benchmarks, which puts the storms further east of Long Island. So a lot of times Long Island will get the worst of the winds and things like that, but the snowfall rates you get, with the storm. This was the movement to a lot of changes in terms of the impacts and the way Staten Island's coastal communities kind of dealt with coastal flooding as part of as part of the makeup of how communities had to exist with flood threats like this. So
how to deal with them.
And long-term person, who recently passed, and a good friend, John LaFamina, was associated with the Oakwood Civic Association, was kind of spearheaded a lot of what they call the Oakwood shoreline. Federal government stepped in. This storm was a wind and rain maker, and the coastal flood situation was probably unprecedented in terms of the depth and the breadth of how much it impacted across.
There was rowboat evacuation, particularly in the Oakwood Beach area. So people actually, couldn't even swim. They needed lifeboats to rescue them.
There was multiple water rescues. It was on the coastal communities of Staten Island. It was clearly a 100-year storm at the time. Not something you used to. I think when you looked at Hurricane Sandy and Kissimmee Avenue, a lot of the water rescues took place back down there. These coastlines were extremely vulnerable.
Long Island, I read there was 8 feet of standing water in certain areas.
Yes.
Above our heads.
If you remember, also too, there were rescues on the FDR Drive. Flooding extended into Manhattan.
Rowboat rescues on the FDR?
Yeah, I mean, there was people literally standing in. I never forget that there were pictures of people standing on the roofs of cars on the FDR Drive in the midst of traffic. The surge of water coming in from the ocean overwhelmed an entire entire stretch. It was somewhere in the Midtown area, and it was a really serious event that, again, was not predicted to the extent that it was impactful. And that's really what makes these storms kind of unusual, in the sense that a lot of the ones, the worst ones, were the ones that kind of didn't have a foretelling of their arrival. So, they didn't predict them to the point where people would take measurable steps to address safety measures and restricting roadways and things like that, without because they just didn't know the impacts of the coastal flood problem. So and I believe that's the case in the Oakwood Beach area, where these typical areas prior to the 92 storm have lived relatively comfortably without having any real. The fact that they were vulnerable didn't exist in their minds, because of the fact there was a long time passing between any event of that magnitude, and people were just left unsure.
They probably didn't receive evacuation orders.
In 92 there were evacuation orders, but they were almost after the fact.
Well, yeah, because when a storm comes on like that, it's so quick.
Right. The meteorologists at the time did not equate the at least from my recollection, they didn't equate the amount of coastal flooding associated with this nor'easter. And I hate to say this, the 92 nor'easter benchmarked the first, what I call, in the series of what I call the change in just how nor'easters impacted Staten Island. It was not very as common a threat here as after that point on. And if you look through the history, that's the oddity of this particular storm and how rapidly it's been impacting the coastlines here. So again, when you talk about the 92 nor'easter, again, a non-predicted to the extent of the coastal flood problem, but then developing plans was part of FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, and began to draft plans for to stop storm surge flooding from being a concern. A lot of plans, but a lot of things there did not fully. There were temporary things put up and placed and rotted away, and then when it came to the subsequent storms, the measures that were instituted in 92 were not quite up to par with the storms that happened after that point.
And apparently they should have stopped ferry service, because I read that there was a ferry boat that I couldn't dock for 4 hours. Imagine how scary that must have been. 4 hours on a boat you don't know if you're going to make it off of.
Yeah, I mean, there was harrowing moments. I do think at times that people, I mean, you kind of talk about these things as not being, I mean, we get, New York people are generally complacent about the fact that how weather impacts them. So you see the site temper, that they don't feel like there's a threat that exists in the weather realm. So what happens is that, people take unnecessary risks and chances, and it's, it takes on a different meaning to people who live here, who think this city is like, that
like a fortress.
Yeah, a fortress of steel and concrete. What the heck could happen here, right? So it's definitely
it's ill prepared for hurricanes.
Yeah,
I can pretty much say that confidently.
Yeah, it hasn't been prepared for just the coastal flood management for quite a long time. But we'll move on to
number two,
which is the 2010 storm.
Yes,
the no-name storm.
You're putting the no-name storm above the named storms. Some of them.
Now, this is for the people that watch. This storm was one of the wildest storms in history here, and from the terms of this was highly localized.
And that's why it didn't really make the news very much.
Yeah, I mean, but it did make the news. But this was a series of 3 storms. We talk about 2010 started what I call the first 3 mega storms that I say that really changed Staten Island, and this was the start. 2010, and people who don't know, the 2000 March. Matter of fact, we're stepping on the anniversary of year 8. but the amount of wind damage associated with the storm was unprecedented.
And what happened to your house? We were talking a little
Yeah,
bit
I mean,
about
it was a disaster. Insurance claims, water, literally the winds, sustained winds were measured, and there were gusts, somewhere around 55, 60 sustained, and there were gusts at 88 miles an hour recorded in Great Kills, close to 90. So from
just like a Category 2 hurricane.
Yes. So you're talking about damages, and it was kind of like a surreal, and nobody predicted it. Right. There was not even the mildest prediction. There was no warnings of coastal flooding. None. I mean, and
your house was flooding as well, you said, right?
Well, I mean, it didn't flood. I mean, we had
the window.
The wind was blowing actually through hard. It blew through the seams of the windows. That's how hard. When you talk about rain, you talk about how hard winds blow, and you talk about the impacts of this particular storm. It was so intense wind-wise that you could almost count at least 3 trees on every block, all down. Wires, I believe somewhere around 80% of Staten Island was without electric.
Wow. You posted a few photos on the page this morning from some that you've taken of bad storms. Were any of those photos?
Yes, there's the one actually along the coastal front there. I believe it's that's down by Atlantic Village, which is on the page itself. I'm trying to think, but the tree that collapsed is in a house in Annandale. But that was a scene that played out so dramatically across Staten Island that, it's forgotten in the midst of Sandy.
Right.
But I would put this is number 2 ahead of even the 92 nor'easter. When you talk about the terms of total impact, there were politicians locally that were trying to call for this to be declared a disaster area over the fact of the amount of damages associated with the insured losses here is unbelievable. I wonder if there's anybody else that really remembers the 2010 storm, because it was absolutely insane.
I mean, these were like trees being uprooted and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it was, like I said, you talked about an impactful storm. This definitely tops as at least my pick, and I know the picks we kind of went over together, but this storm, besides Hurricane Sandy, from a wind perspective and a total, affecting the most widest range of folks, this particular storm hits the mark. So you talk about coastal flooding, a lot of houses. Now, unbeknownst to the people who are in these coastal flood regions, this came on with a surprise. So they were surprised by watching the water creep in, and before you know it, there was no evacuations associated with this particular storm, although there was substantial storm surge related damages associated with it. So the impacts there were wide ranging. So it was really something to remember as a Staten Islander. It's, like I said, unprecedented. But then, of course, there's nothing that really tops the next one.
Yeah, probably anyone watching is going to guess our next pick.
Staten Island and Hurricane Sandy, which is Sandy, of course,
was devastating.
Yeah.
That's an understatement.
And, I think, you could talk about that event specifically as being, just a coastal flood event. What made this particularly bad for Staten Island is actually where Staten Island's positioned in the New York Harbor.
Right. I was reading it's sort of like the Raritan Bay is kind of a funnel.
Yeah, if you think of a funnel, basically, if you look at Long Island and the coastal parts of New Jersey, and you have an easterly fetch of wind, everything funnels into the Raritan Bay. And the interesting part of that is that you talk about storm gauge readings that are all-time highs. I mean, right down the block here, which is not too far from our office, I mean, you're talking about, when you talk about category of storms, and I think as bad as Staten Island's coastal regions are as far as even density, it's still not as bad as many places in America. So, I mean, yes, it impacted a lot of. It could have been far worse if we were on a flat plane, because it was really subjecting.
We are very hilly. We have some. I live on a very high point of the island.
So, like, even though we're not far from the coast where we're sitting right now, if you look back behind us, it's actually the ocean front isn't that far away, but here. And the interesting thing is that the we're upwards of 30 feet from sea level. But in this particular storm, you basically talk about a storm surge of 16, 17 feet. And you talk about that in terms of size and mass on as far as like hurricane scale. I mean, you're talking about this being one of the top 10 storm surge events in American history.
And not to mention the size of the storm.
Yeah, the size of the storm.
If I'm not mistaken, I think it's a record holder for the radius of the storm itself. It was absolutely enormous.
It's an enormous storm, and of course, as being the number one storm, it's something that people have seen 1,000 times already. There's 1,000 documentaries, but basically, the interesting thing is that from this point on is how that's changed our coastlines and the future of. Now many of the houses that were in Sandy,
some people 5 years later have still not recovered from the effects of this.
Yeah, the interesting thing is if this happened again or repaired, and the answer is, I don't think so.
No, we got some little mounds of sand on the beach. Well, the berms.
Well, I mean, I think that it's a short-term measure to a long-term problem. The question really remains: is Staten Island more prepared than ever? I think that sets the bar for everything storm related that will probably most people in a lifetime will ever see. Hopefully, But
fingers
again, that's something that really impacted lives here. So I mean, it was the most.
We had the most casualties in New York City.
Yes,
which was 23 people. Killed on the island.
And in tragic fashion. Some of these stories are absolutely horrific. And the thing about it is that, for Staten Islanders and things like that, we're not immune to these type of events, and that should be a highlight to say that, weather preparedness is part of being safe. And I still think a lot of people neglect the fact that these things are still even possible today. Oh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Let's not be prepared. But things are being done now. The buyouts are a big plus because they're just,
this was land that people should not be living on because it's just...
Yeah, I mean, for that particular
they're
case,
wetlands.
Yeah, and I think in the documents related to how FEMA wanted to go about it, these were already kind of outlined as places to buy out because of a storm surge event like that. But the big thing is that you basically have a situation now where we have to find ways to mitigate the circumstances because the last 10 to 15 years have been absolutely devastating to the coastlines here, and based on just the frequency, it doesn't seem like, maybe not to the scale of Sandy, that these events are necessarily limited to the past. So there's some things with these things, but like I said, we've recovered for the most part, and I do think that Sandy, from a large part of Staten Island's perspective, is that for as horrible as the events were, a lot of the damage was limited to coastal regions, but the power infrastructure too was massively. The big damage really happened at the coastline. Power infrastructure.
Midland Beach and South Beach, and also Annandale hit pretty bad.
Mm-hmm. But like I said, we're stating the obvious with that. Right. But I think the most notable is that 2010 one. The no-name storm was a surprise and a shocker. So that as being the kind of the wild card in this mix. But it's always fun to talk about some of the events on Staten Island.
Especially, you won't see the 2010 storm make any of those top storm lists, probably because it was so hyper-local here.
Yeah, not many people are going to talk about it. I mean, outside of Staten Island, it was really, I mean, even the other boroughs were not impacted. Meteorologically speaking, I can't really, you could diagnose that much better why that was, but it just seemed to be a real interesting event. And basically, without warning, you
One
woke
that
up.
You're not going to forget.
Yeah, I mean, it's just insane. It was an insane storm, but it's definitely something. But if you're into that nostalgia, I think Hannah's going to post some stuff up in the next few days, maybe in relation to that, because we have some good stuff on it.
Yeah, we got a lot of good photos.
Yes. But anyway.
Well, that's our list.
That's our list, and it's always exciting to kind of give you a little bit of the back years of Staten Island history, and knowing, like, as harmful as this was and the stuff that's associated, it ties into the identity of Staten Islanders. So it's always
kind of
interesting
dodged a lot of bullets this month too. So
yeah, and a matter of fact,
reading these things, I feel lucky that these storms weren't worse.
Next month, I think next week sometime there's another nor'easter possibly on the horizon.
Oh boy!
Which includes snow. So I think that's for
Wednesday,
Thursday. Yeah. That's the way it goes. What could you do?
It was wrong.
But anyway, it's been fun. Always.
It's been fun. As always. Thanks.
It's nice to talk weather with a Florida person.
Well, it's not
just the southern sand.
Not quite. I'm used to more hurricanes than you, mister. More hurricane threats, anyway. But Florida's better prepared for it. Florida expects these kind of things, and they build their houses up higher.
Is that how it goes there?
Generally, my house was on stilts that I grew up in, so we were always kind of okay with the flooding. For example, a lot of these bungalows in Midland Beach, they're so close to the ground.
Yeah.
Close to the sea level.
It's really unprecedented. But again, guys, until next time, it's always fun. Leave your comments and
let
concerns.
us know if you have any memories of storms in your lifetime.
And please let us know.
Any personal stories. We'll always read your comments.
That's it. So, folks, thanks. Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend. Signing off, and I will see you next week.